Hello everyone. So one of my viewers asked me to talk a little bit about the langets, right, and how they attach to the poleaxe. Okay, so first of all, what's a poleaxe? And in different places of Europe, they spoke different languages, and within those regions, they even had different dialects. So don't get too caught up in the name. Poleaxe versus Warhammer, versus like Fiore just calls this a haja or an axe. So don't get too caught up in the name. What it really comes down to is it a two-piece head or is it a one-piece head, right? So the poleaxe has a two-piece head where you got a top spike and you got some type of a hammer or an axe, as opposed, right? As opposed to your halberd or your bill hook, or your glaive, which is basically a one-piece head that sockets down to the shaft. Okay, so this is a one-piece head. So you can still have a hammer or an axe and some type of a top spike, and I can make this look almost exactly like those. Okay, but the main thing here is that this is a one-piece design. It may look bigger, but it's usually thinner. Okay, and that's what allows this to go on a longer shaft, right? And I can swing and recover, right? Because there's less weight on that end over there. And usually, if you're using a halberd, like the way the Landsknechts would use them, you'd be like in large block formations, and a lot of times you're using this in large formation. You're using this hook over here to try pull people off of horses. So that makes sense where you need a lighter head with more reach. Okay, so you're not going to be really dueling with this, right? But this is, because for one thing, I mean, look just how hard it is to, maneuver and handle this. Okay, but this is great for reach if I'm trying to hit somebody on a horse or pull somebody off of a horse. Okay, so for dueling purposes, we're usually using shorter weapons. Okay, this poleaxe over here consists of two pieces. So you've got a top spike, right, like you see here, that comes down and it locks the hammer or the axe in place, and then it rivets down onto the shaft. So the top spike is the key that holds this thing together. If this top spike were to come off, then the hammer would also come off, and all you have is a stick here with this metal siding here, which actually is still pretty good for hitting people with, right? But the top spike's what holds this thing together. So now within that, there's usually two methods. One is where the spike with the langets here, they go through the axe head, right? So if you see over here, there's an eye or a hole in the axe head. The legs comes through, and then they spread, right? And they sit on the shaft over here, okay? And then they get riveted down. So what's holding this hammer in place here is the fact that you got the shoulder on top, so you got a wider area on top, and then you got a wider area on the bottom over here, right? That's what holds this in place, okay? So the other design is like this one over here, where it's almost the same thing over here, where the legs go around the head. You see how I have it wasted here, right? I basically hammered the head down. So this comes down, it locks it in place, and then it rivets through, okay? So this is the other main type of design that we see. But there is a hybrid that I used over here. So on this one over here, right, the blade, right, because on this one I have a blade instead of a spike, went through. There's still a shoulder over here. It's just more narrow. So the head stops on the shoulder over here. The legs split a little bit, right? But I didn't think I had enough material on top and on the bottom to lock this in place. So what I did is I ran two rivets through the head to hold it in place, right? So that's also a design that you will see where they use rivets, and sometimes they'll use side spikes, right? and we're going to talk about how those side spikes might be attached. But the important thing, though, is that those side spikes were really to hold this together. They're not so much so that you can hit people with the side spikes, because those side spikes are fasteners, and if you're hitting people with the fastener or the thing that's holding it together, it increases the chance that it's going to come apart at some point. Okay, so on this one over here, I actually have it wasted. Like, see how I brought it in, so that kind of protects the rivets a little bit, and it's also by hammering this thinner. Also, when I put those rivets through the head, there was less material that I had to go through. Okay, so hey everyone, I want to include this image from Talhofer. If you look at the bottom right corner, you'll see an image of the side spikes, and you can see how they they had to actually hand cut those threads and make the two pieces fit together. A very time-consuming process. Definitely something that was geared more for appearance. Like to gift to royalty. Okay, and I definitely would not want to be hitting somebody with the side spike, which is essentially just a fastener. So now that's kind of like an overview. I've covered this in other videos of how the construction of these poleaxes is. Now, one of the things, like, why did I use this method here versus this method over here? Well, with this method, like I said, I needed the material. I needed more material on the top and more material on the bottom to lock this hammer in place, which means that this needed to be thicker, which also is more weight over here. So in order for me to be able to swing and recover, this needed to be shorter. Okay, so with these other two methods here, right? So I'm able to go thinner on the shaft so that this could be a little bit longer, right? So on this one over here, even though this is the longest, this is the thinnest over here. So I'm still able to hold this from the end over here, swing it, and recover, right? I can swing up to that side. I got an end cap on this side for hitting. Then I can turn it and hit on that side. Okay, so that's a concern, right? The longer this is, in general, the lighter it needs to be in order for me to be able to move it around. Okay, so as far as the langets, right, which is the thing that we really wanted to focus on today, but I kind of needed to give you guys that information, which like I said, I've covered in other videos. You got these langets that come down and hold it in place here. Now, when we look at some of these historical pieces, sometimes the langets on the top spike are really long. Okay, they might be coming all the way down here. So instead of having these steel langets that I have here as separate pieces, you can have this piece that comes down, a little bit longer. So for my construction method, I prefer to keep these langets on the top spike a little bit shorter, right? The reason is because this is a much more difficult, this is a more difficult piece to forge, especially when it comes to making this curve over here, right? Because in order for me to work this, I have to heat it up, right? It has to go into the forge. Every time this goes in the forge, and it goes into the fire, it comes out, okay, I do some hammering. I can only get so far before it starts cooling, and they do cool pretty fast, and then it needs to go back into the fire. The problem is every time it goes into the fire and it comes out, we get oxidation. You get basically accelerated rusting. You can actually see flakes coming off of it. So every time it goes in and out of the fire, I lose material, right? It gets thinner and thinner every time. So I don't have the ability to put it in and out of the fire an indefinite amount of times, because at some point this is going to start getting too thin from the accelerated oxidation. Okay, so there's a certain amount of work that it takes to create this shape here, and then make the legs here and get this curve over here. And what I don't want to do is, okay, I did that, and now I want to make these a little bit longer. So that means I got to work on them a little bit more. So that means more time in and out of the fire. So practically speaking, it makes a lot more sense for me to work this piece here, finish it, put it to the side, and then say, hey, okay, now I'm ready to work on this section of langets from here to here, okay? Because these langets here, right? These side langets, right? Because you have basically your top spike, got your top spike langets, right? And then in this case, the top spike langets are separate from the side langets that I have on these poleaxes, right? You can see how they're separate, right? Right, and then you can also have fore and aft langets. You can have langets in front and behind, and a lot of times that's used where the langets don't come all the way to the edge, right? Because I want to be able to hit with this, right? Actually, with this poleaxe, the center of percussion is right here. This is the hardest hitting part of this poleaxe. This is good because it gives me a little extra reach behind somebody's block, right? So if somebody blocks me here, I get a little bit extra reach where I can still hit them. So that's how I use the spikes and the hammers that protrude. Okay, that's one of the benefits of this. But this is a very valid hitting surface, right? All the way up down to here. So in making these side langets here, I mean, what does it look like to you, right? This pretty much looks like a sword, right? Almost like a sword blade, okay? So essentially what I got here is I got a sword on one side and a sword on the other side, right? You know, maybe it doesn't have a sharp edge, but it does have an edge, right? That's the part that's gonna hit. So as you guys probably already know, like forging a sword can be a very, you know, it's a very laborious process, right? To draw out the metal long like this, okay, and to shape it, you know, get it straight, get it of the right thickness. So that's a reason why I would want to separate, like basically I would want to finish the top spike, okay, and say, okay, this is done, and now I'm going to work on this section of langets here, right? This section of langets here. And you know, do that in a section, and then say, okay, now I want to work on this section of langets from here to here, okay? So as you can see here, these langets here, they get thinner, okay, because basically at this point here, I'm not looking for a hitting surface. Here I'm just looking to reinforce the wood, okay? So I want to reinforce the wood, so this is really, really solid. So again, what I can do is I can stick this in the ground and use this to lever somebody over, you know, and then once they're on the ground with their feet in the air, you know, I can look for an unarmored gap between their legs, okay? Because that's, you know, essentially to defeat somebody, you got to get the pointy part into an unarmored gap, okay? You know, that's why you see this poleaxe in sections, right? So with this one over here, you got the top spike here, with the top spike langets and there, and then you've got this section over here which continues down to here, okay? So this is one section down to here, and you can see how I have like a double rivet over here, right? So that the two pieces are held together. And what I do is I actually file them down so that it's almost a smooth transition. And then this section over here is a lot thinner because this is just reinforcing the wood. And then over here, it gets wider because this is a hitting surface, right? So I got this going all the way to the edge. I got an end cap over here. So that's the reason why these langets exist and why I made them the way I made them. You know, blacksmithing is a lot about, you know, you gotta be a little creative, all right? There's no one way to do things. Basically I've been fighting with medieval weapons for about 18 years, right? You know, I've done HEMA, I've done SCA, I've played with a couple of other groups. I played with EMP, Solara. So I have a lot of fighting experience that I bring into the construction of these poleaxes, okay? So next thing I want to address is, okay, well, fine, we got the langets, we understand why they're there. we understand why we got these in sections, right? Because it's easier for me to work on this in sections rather than try to make these legs go all the way down here. Because now if I screw up, like let's say I have these legs, right? Let's say I constructed this so that the legs extend all the way down. Well, if you think about it, let's say I screw up down here somehow. Well, now the whole thing is junk, right? I got to start all over again. Or I got to basically just cut it, right? Which I do, because these originally were a lot longer, and then I just cut them, okay? So it kind of makes more sense for me to work on this and to break this up into sections, and rather than try to have one single long piece that goes all the way down, okay? So let's talk about the rivets. Okay, how do these rivets go in there? How do they hold this thing together? So when it comes to rivets, so here's the thing: a lot of times when you look at like museum pieces, you've got rivets that like really stand out. They're very decorative. Okay, as somebody that actually fights with these things, the important thing to me is that these rivets don't interfere with me sliding my hands back and forth. Okay, so if you look at these rivets, they are flush, they are smooth, okay, so that my hands can slide up and down really easy, right? I did that with all of them. So from a practical fighting perspective, that's what I want. I want to be able to slide back and forth, okay? So there's two types of, well, actually there's three types of rivets, but two main types that were used, okay? So the one type is what they called clinch rivets, which were probably the more common ones. So the clinch rivets, basically the blacksmith made something that looked like this. So you take your leftover metal scraps and you just forge them into something pointy like this, okay? And then what you do before after you construct the langets, what you do is you got to hot punch a hole through. So you get it hot, and then you take a spike and a hammer, and you put a hole through it, right? You hot punch a hole through the steel. So by hot punching that hole, you're going to be able to run the rivet through it. So what you could do is you could take a rivet like this, right? And you would cut this to where you need to cut it, right? So basically I would need it about there. So that means I would probably cut it about here, right? So you only, now here's the thing, there's only a hole on one side and there's a hole on the other side, but the two holes don't necessarily match up. So what happens is when I start hammering this through, when it gets to the other side here, now this isn't like a nail, this isn't like a hardened steel, this is fairly soft steel. So when this gets through to the other side, it's actually going to start curving down, right? It's going to curve down into the wood, and that's what's going to lock the rivets in place, okay? Now, what's going to happen is a lot of times you may not get enough of the rivet through, so then I would have to clip a section over here, right? I could put, I would have to clip a section over here, and then I would just hammer it flat against this, and then, there's going to be a nice section that sticks out, right? So I'm going to hammer it as flat as I can, and then just file it down, right? File it or grind it down. So that's your clinch rivet, right? Where it goes through, and then it curves. It hits the other side of the metal. It doesn't go through it. It curves down, and then it holds in place. So you do this from both sides. You got rivets going here, then you got rivets going through on this side. Okay, and when you look at pictures of historical pieces, you'll notice that when you look at the side profile, the rivets don't match up, right? Like on this one over here, you can see that the rivet on this side perfectly matches up with the rivet on that side, okay? So this one clearly went all the way through. But when you look at some historical pieces, you'll see a rivet head here, right? And then you'll see the next one here, and then you'll see the next one here, and then you'll see the next one here and here. So they do not match up. So that's how you know that they used clinch rivets that go through and they curve, and that's what locks the langets in place. Okay. So the other style is where you actually do have the rivets that go all the way through. Okay. So the difficulty there when you got rivets that go all the way through is making a hole, having your holes, right? Because you got basically the holes need to be made in advance. The holes have to match up, right? So to do that, okay, so it's a bit more work. What I would do is I would take the two pieces, right? I would put them flat on each other, right? Maybe like tie them together with some wire or something, right? Put it in the forge, get it hot, and then hot punch a hole all the way through. All right. So when it gets hot, I mean, you know, 1/8 inch steel. You know, when it's cold, it's pretty strong. But when it's hot, right, when it's red hot, it's fairly easy to punch a hole through. And I would punch the holes through, right. So that's how I get my holes to match up, right. And then I can put it on the wood shaft, okay. And then I could run a rivet through it. Now, what kind of a rivet would I use for something like that? Well, again, something similar to this, but I wouldn't use the pointy side here, right? I would basically cut it here, right? I would cut it here, and I would use this section here, and what I would do is I would basically hammer this through all the way, right? And then once this goes through all the way, and it's sticking out on both sides like this, I put it on the anvil, and I basically hammer on one side, hammer on the other side, and basically I just mushroom it, right? I just I mushroom it on both sides. You know, and then at some point I would just file it down so that this got really smooth. And I want to show you an example, just a practical example, right? I got this pick that I use, okay, where it broke, right? The wood broke, and I couldn't quite get it to fit right. So what I did is I welded these langets onto the wood here, right? And then what I did is I drilled a hole on through the langets that went all the way through. And then what did I use for a rivet here? Because I didn't have any rivets that were quite this wide. So all I did was I took this tent stake, right? So this is like a tent stake, which is soft metal, right? So you can't use nails because nails are like hardened. Anything that's soft, like this tent stake, basically I ran this through. I clipped it, right? I cut it here, right? I put it on the anvil, and what I did is I mushroomed one side, and then I mushroomed the other side. And what happens is when you mushroom it, the ends like mushroom over, but also the shaft or the shank itself gets wider, okay? And it kind of fills in that gap, and that's what holds this in place, and this is working pretty good, okay? So rivets are basically like, it's basically the scrap metal that you got left over that you turn into a fastener. Okay, that's the rivets that we generally, that's what we use for rivets. Now, for the construction of these poleaxes here, because here's the thing, making these things, making rivets. Can be a little time consuming, right? Getting them to the right size, So I did kind of cheat this a little bit. And I ordered these Hansen 1.5-inch rivets on Amazon. Okay, so there you go. Those are the rivets that I mostly use because they're 3/16, so they're uniform. Basically they're all the same thickness. It just makes the construction go a little bit faster because in constructing these pole arms, I don't want to. There's only so much time I want to spend in. I want to put into actual riveting. Okay, and so I don't want to create rivets, especially if it's something that I'm going to grind down, make them flat, and it's not meant to be decorative. It's just meant to be functional. So the rivets go through the hole, right? See, like you see right there, it went through that hole. It got to the end there, right? And then what I did is I clipped the excess on this side. I maybe left like a 1/4 inch, you know, and then I hammered this side. I mushroomed it, and then as you can see here, right, there's way too much of a head on this. So then you just either file it or grind it down, and you make it flush. Because if you don't do that, when you slide your hands back and forth, it's going to catch on those rivets. And I don't want that. I want this to be nice, and I want to be able to run my hands up and down. You know, that's a practical concern, okay? I'm not interested in these rivets looking nice. I'm interested in this being functional. Now, if this was going to go to, like, if I was planning to give this to royalty, yeah, then I might be more concerned with how the rivets look. Maybe I would use brass. You know, maybe I would make them stick out a little bit more, make them more decorative. So in a lot of the museum pieces that you see where the rivets, like, they stand out a lot, you know, that's because that really wasn't meant so much for fighting. That was meant for display. That was meant to be given as a gift to royalty. And they look really good, and that's why they ended up in museums, right? The weapons that were actually used in battles, you know, they didn't survive for more than maybe, you know, I mean, they didn't survive so long, depending on how much they were used, or if they were used in duels frequently. They didn't last long. Okay, in fact, a lot of the poleaxes that we see, there's actually artwork that we have of poleaxes, because most of the poleaxes, the langets only go down to about here, and then you got wooden shaft over here. And what we see is that they will usually break right where the langets end. Okay, so that's from this hitting, you know, wherever the langets end, that's the weak point. That's where they usually break. So then there's actually a historical piece in the, there's a couple of historical pieces, but there's one in particular that I based this design on in the Wallace collection, number A925, that has langets that extend all the way down, okay? So that is, that is the superior method. Now, question becomes, why didn't they have langets that extend all the way down like I have done here? Okay, so remember what I said earlier, right? These langets, right, they're essentially like sword blades on each side, okay? So as you guys know, like forging something that's long and thin like a sword takes a lot of effort, right? Swords were expensive. So on this thing over here, effectively, I got 4 swords, right? One here, one here, one here, and one here, right? So that adds a lot of time, a lot of expense. So that's the reason why you typically see the langets, come up to here. A lot of times they were concerned with actually preserving the langets so they don't come all the way to the edge. They would rather sacrifice the wood and save the langets that they can reuse, right? They can take the axe head, put it on another shaft. So this is an important practical thing here. Me building this thing, right? I have like access to an unlimited amount of metal, right? I can go to a junkyard. I can go to, I got scrap. So I have access to lots of metal. And the type of metal that we usually use, right? The type of metal that, let's say, welders use, right? Is usually long and thin, right? And they use that to weld pieces together. Like even if you look at if you look on the underside of your truck or your car, you're going to see lots of L bars and straight bars. So we typically work a lot with that. So it's easier for us to find. For blacksmiths back in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, this was a lot of work to make these long, thin bars. This is actually the easier part, right? Because if you look at this head, it's like, to most people, they'll look at these two heads and they'll say, wow, this head is really different from this head. It would actually take very little effort for me to heat this thing up over here and basically pound this, on an anvil flat so that it looks like this, okay? So going from this to this is fairly simple, or going from something like this to something like that. That's the easy part, okay? The harder part is how this thing comes together and making these. I mean, if I was blacksmithing this from scratch, where I didn't have access to, you know, long, like basically rolled metal, right? Because when metal is produced today, they roll it out in these sheets, and we get like these long straight sheets that is a really easy starting point for us. Even if you go to a junkyard and you start going through it, you're gonna find, you know, long straight pieces of metal, right? Because that's what welders work with. So for me, it's a lot easier to find this type of metal as a starting point. What's harder for me, what's more expensive for me, is to find the wood, right? Because this is oak wood. Historically, they used mostly ash, and they also used oak. So ash is like really hard to get. It's really expensive. There's some type of a bug that's been eating all the ash trees in the United States. So ash is hard for us to get. Oak wood, which is like kind of like the next best thing, which is a really strong, thick wood, is more expensive. Hickory is another option, but hickory is completely not historical because they didn't have any of that. I don't think they had hickory in Europe. So oak is what I'm using here. So oak is expensive, okay? So the steel for me is cheaper than the oak. If the reverse was true, right? If the steel was more expensive than the oak, then what I would do is I would probably put less. I wouldn't put any steel certainly down here. I would make this just wider, okay? So the availability of resources, economics is, you know, drives how these things are put together. So at a time, in a time where steel is more expensive, right, and harder to work with, you're going to see less metal, right, in the poleaxes, and more wood, right? So you're going to see longer, thicker shafts. Today, we're kind of like the opposite is true, where the oak wood is more expensive than the steel, and it's also like just hard to get. Like I got access to metal. I don't have. There's only so many places that sell oak, and it's only in certain sizes, etc. So this is an example where it was the most economical for me to buy oak wood that was like 3/4 of an inch thick, okay, by 1.5 inches wide, because it was pre-cut to that size. So that was the cheapest thing for me to buy in oak wood, and then just reinforce it with steel and run the rivets through it, which gives this thing a lot of strength. Okay, so economics have a lot to do with how you're gonna put these things together. So that's it. That's I also want to show you guys one thing. If you look at these hammers here, one of the problems that I've always had with hammers is that, you know, the shaft always comes loose from the eye of the head here. So I use the medieval technique where they didn't weld, but I use a welder. I just weld these langets on here, and then I run a rivet through it, and now this thing is like almost indestructible. Okay, same thing here. Okay, so this is this is a really good method of attaching heads to shafts. Okay, so anyway, drop some comments. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll talk to y'all soon.